Good evening and welcome to the channel. I am D, your humble host and guide past the prowling perils of horror history. In the late 70s and early 80s, the cinematic horror landscape saw a drastic change as the slasher trend exploded onto the scene. Suddenly, the scariest thing America could think of was a random guy with a sharp object. It makes sense, as the real-life murders of serial killers like John Wayne Gacy were still on everyone's mind. It's a reasonable thing to be afraid of, and there were tons of these movies made, so I thought it'd be fun to take a deeper dive into the genre. I've already talked about movies like Halloween, Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, so as not to repeat myself, I present to you my pick for the top 10 slasher movies which I have not yet touched upon. Released in 1976, The Town That Dreaded Sundown predates the slasher trend, which took off for real after John Carpenter's Halloween kicked the door down in 1978. It is loosely based on the real-life killings in Texarkana in the 40s and purports to be a faithful retelling, even though it takes quite a few factual liberties. I mean, I'm sure the trombone scene is super accurate, for instance. The family of one victim even filed a lawsuit over the inaccuracies, so yeah. The movie is presented as a docudrama with its dry narration and punctuated timeline lending it an air of detached credibility, but otherwise it checks all the usual slasher boxes. There's a masked killer, a feeling of social anxiety, and horny teenagers in peril. The Town That Dreaded Sundown is a decent film. Nothing too special really, but when viewed as a precursor to where cinema was headed, it's a fascinating sign of its time. Tourist Trap. Here's a largely forgotten little gem that only the geekiest horror buffs will bring to the table. It's an outlier in the slasher genre, as it also has a few supernatural elements. Kind of a strange choice, but it does help make the movie stand out a bit in the crowd. And hey, you won't hear me complain about little telekinesis every now and then. Tourist Trap might not have the strongest plot or the most memorable characters, but the movie has quite a few good things going for it, not the least its main setting in a strange secluded museum of mechanic dolls and mannequins. It is a mixed bag, however. One of few slashers with a PG rating, perhaps the only one really, Tourist Trap kind of fell through the cracks of the rating system at the time. The result is a movie that goes from being quite gruesome in some scenes to being too tame in others. But it's smart enough to play to its strength, and overall it works just fine. Allegedly, this is one of Stephen King's favorite movies. Not really relevant or anything, but a fun little factoid for you there. Slasher films have a proud tradition of angering parents and church groups, but few movies get the PTA quite as riled up as Silent Night, Deadly Night. Easily one of the most controversial movies of the 80s. Parents fear that its depiction of a killer dressed as Santa, which also appeared in promotional spots, would traumatize children and undermine their trust in the real Santa Claus. It wasn't the first Christmas-themed horror movie though. Black Christmas and Christmas Evil were both released years before this one, without any noticeable backlash. Despite the massive protests, the movie was moderately successful and initially even outgrossed The Nightmare on Elm Street, which opened the same weekend, albeit in a lot fewer theaters. Silent Night, Deadly Night playfully toys with its thematical setting and keeps a steady balance between humor and gore, although I honestly think they could have taken the concept even further. Still, a first-rate slasher and a given entry on any decent holiday wishlist. The Funhouse is a nostalgic little piece by famed chainsaw director Tobe Hooper. It references several classic horror films from the 30s and 40s Gothic era, as well as more recent movies like Halloween and Psycho. The story is as simple as it is classic. A traveling carnival with a bad reputation is in town, and some teenagers decide to secretly stay there for the night. They have fun at first, but it all takes a dark turn when they happen to witness a murder, and soon they become the hunted. The killer in this film is a bizarre visage, purportedly the result of a genetic defect. Sure. Anyway, The Funhouse is peak early 80s entertainment. A genuinely fun movie that uses its setting brilliantly and constantly throws curveballs at the audience. It knows its legacy as well as its own place in history, and is damn proud of it. Pieces is yet another proof that the slasher concept works as long as you make a good movie out of it. The premise here is a chainsaw-wielding maniac who's collecting parts from carefully selected victims for his human jigsaw puzzle. It's just as hysterical and gory as it sounds. While the movie is set in the US, it's actually a Spanish movie. Weirder still is that it feels like an Italian giallo film, all down to the looks of the sets and even the design of the killer. The acting is sometimes atrociously bad, to the point where some scenes have become classic examples of bad acting moments.
Killing her! Bastard! Bastard!
But the kills though, that's where this movie truly shines. There's really not a whole lot to say about this one. Pieces is hardly groundbreaking and doesn't pretend to be more than it is. It's just a highly entertaining slasher movie with lots of blood and violence. Simple and far from perfect, but great all the same. Just like Mama used to make 'em. Prom Night is probably one of the more important entries on this list. It's often considered one of the initial 3 films that got the slasher ball rolling, together with Halloween and Friday the 13th. But in that family, it's probably the younger sibling. The film stars Jamie Lee Curtis, one of the mammoth names of the genre, in her peak scream queen years. Leslie Nielsen is in this too, by the way, in one of his final serious roles before he went full-time comedian. The plot surrounds a tragedy years ago when a young girl fell to her death, honestly one of the gutsiest opening scenes of its day really. The kids swear to never speak of it again, but later of course the past comes back to haunt them. Gee, I hope no revival-era horror flick decides to shamelessly rip that plot off or something. Anyway, Prom Night is, more than its peers, a child of the 70s. For example, there are a couple of hilariously outdated disco scenes in it that drag on for ages and are sure to draw a laugh or two these days. But apart from them, the film has aged quite well and still holds up just fine. The Burning is a film that didn't get much buzz upon its release, but has gained a cult following in more recent times. This was partly because, at a first glance, The Burning looks quite a bit like a huge knockoff of Friday the 13th. I mean, the campsite setting and the premise of a killer seeking revenge for past wrongdoings does invoke a certain, shall we say, air of exploitation. But from what I've heard, even though The Burning came out a year later, it was in pre-production before Friday the 13th was released. I guess the time was simply just right for summer camp slashers. Like Friday the 13th, the special effects in this were created by the legendary Tom Savini, one of the most celebrated names of the era. The Burning contains what I consider to be some of his finest work, showcased not the least in the infamous canoe massacre scene, one of the craziest string of visuals in slasher history. If you're unsure just why Savini is one of the most celebrated names in the horror genre, just lean back and enjoy the show. Also worth mentioning here is The Prowler, released the same year, which also has some magnificent examples of his work. Savini himself allegedly considers that one of his finest flicks, but personally, I think The Burning is just a tad hotter. Slumber Party Massacre. The slasher trope of violence as sexual symbolism is hardly a secret, but it's usually not quite on the nose as in this one. But don't mistake this for some cheap exploitation flick, because there's a lot more to it than that. One of few slashers with a female director, Amy Holden Jones, this is in fact a fairly progressive movie. It provides ample commentary about the misogynistic state of Hollywood and American society at the time. Let's face it, the early 80s wasn't exactly the most egalitarian time in recent history. Apart from that though, Slumber Party Massacre is also a damn good slasher film. It's well acted, beautifully shot at times, and has some great kills in it. Also, give some appreciation to the villain, escaped lunatic Ross Thorne, played by Michael Villela, who's one hell of a creepy character. There were 2 sequels to this, which as far as I can tell decided to play up the comedy aspect quite a bit. I must admit that I haven't seen them yet, as they're kinda hard to get hold of, but my expectations aren't too high. The original, however, is a driller. A common technique for filmmakers during the initial wave of slasher films was to start with a holiday or a known celebration and build a movie around it by twisting its themes and conventions. And now, it's time for Valentine's Day. My Bloody Valentine is one of the more brutal movies of its time. While not every aspect of it is aged perfectly, there are indeed a couple of scenes that remain a bit disturbing even to this day. In fairness though, the movie is not as tightly linked to its holiday as many of its peers. There is a team of revenge for a mining incident some years earlier, and the killer is all decked out in mining gear and comes equipped with a handy pickaxe. If top-notch retro violence is what you're hungry for, look no further than this. Just make sure you see the extended version and don't end up with the theatrical release, because this is one of those movies that the censors had a field day with. Luckily, the restored edit seems to be the most common one these days. My Bloody Valentine is a well-made movie, easily one of the top-tier films of the slasher genre, and it kinda gets better every time I see it. For me, this is just true love. Before I reveal my top pick, I thought I'd give a quick honorable mention, or dishonorable mention rather. Just one, potentially the worst slasher film of the early 80s, at least the worst that I've seen. Namely, Don't Go Into the Woods. If you have an hour and a half to spare, why not give it a watch? It is hilariously bad. Just a suggestion. Anyway, let's get back on track. Here's my number one pick for the list. Terror Train. Jamie Lee Curtis snuck her way back onto the list once more. It's a goofy title for a movie, but accurate enough as it's set almost entirely aboard a train rented by a crowd of med students for their graduation party. A masquerade party even, conveniently enough for the killer. Soon enough, people start dying and a connection is made to an incident a couple of years back when a prank gone wrong had one of their classmates hospitalized after a mental breakdown. Has he returned to settle the score? Worth mentioning is a magician played by young David Copperfield. His performance at around the midway point is more than a little out of place, but it does add some charm to the movie, even if his acting is a bit uneven. If I have some complaints, the movie is actually a bit tame for its genre. Most deaths happen off screen and you often only see the aftermath. Also, the movie could have leaned more into the stage magic aspect, maybe use some tricks for kills, that would have been awesome. So, Terror Train is not one of the most hardcore slashers, but the atmosphere and general feel of the movie still makes it very likable. It's a humble but inviting movie that I find myself returning to almost yearly. If you're interested in traveling deeper into slasher territory, I say this is a pretty good spot to hit the tracks. And that concludes my list of the top 10 slasher movies. I hope I've given you one or two worthwhile suggestions, maybe inspired you to maybe watch some of them this Halloween. Remember, everyone's entitled to one good scare. Thank you so much for watching. Catch you on the flip side.